2. I think it is. It says I'm live. Hello and welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 79. Oh, wow. To try and actually get this one going ahead has been something of a hassle. So welcome. As you may notice, it's slightly different. We don't have the little surround screen. I didn't have the count in. For those who haven't picked up on what's been going on, for the same reason there wasn't a podcast last week. Basically, a little under 2 weeks ago, my computer died. I was out the room, I came back into the room, it was dead. A lot of faffing about, and the upshot of which is my son is going to be building me a new computer. Woohoo! Should be bigger, better, stronger, more capable, more wonderful, a beast of a machine. However, it's not going to be ready until probably the end of this week, but should be ready in time for the next podcast. Last week was just too stressful, too many things going on. I haven't figured out how to do anything, and the podcast just had to be essentially postponed. I didn't want to postpone 2 weeks in a row, so I thought I would have a go this week with just trying with this. This is my 10-year-old laptop, which has seriously overheating problems. I mean, I've got a little monitor up on the screen over there telling me the temperature just keeps climbing all the time. So there is every possibility this might suddenly cut out as the laptop overheats. So I hope we will last a bit of time at any rate before it does all that. Because of this old laptop, I'm afraid what I can't do is do the usual screen share, do stuff on Photoshop, show you how to make changes and critique and throw up examples of photos and all this kind of stuff. All the usual stuff, which unfortunately is now absolutely not accessible to me. So what I thought we would do in this episode is let's have a bit of a chat. I asked people to send me some questions. Some people have, but you can also, if you have questions, throw them into the comments. And as for comments, I can still see them here. Let me know where you're from. Say hello. Let me know what the weather is like where you are. That's usually quite a common starting point. Always nice to know what the weather's doing around the rest of the world. And please just be a little bit patient with me while I struggle to get used to, there's a new interface here with it's slightly different when I'm just going live directly from the webcam rather than through OBS, which is a streaming software, that's the bit that allows me to swap screen and put up the timer and the end card and all the other bits. I don't have that. So the interface with YouTube is slightly different. So I'm still kind of feeling my way around it a little bit. So questions, yeah, but it's gonna. I'm hoping this will be a two-way thing. Now, basically, I have three questions. Yeah, three questions for you, the audience, the viewers. So those of you who are watching live, some of you have already. I posted these questions into the Facebook group, Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, and a few people have emailed me. 1 or 2 people put questions into the Facebook group, but you feel free to post questions in the chat here. You know, I mean, here we are. This is as close as we can get to a chat, other than say a Zoom call or something like that. But in terms of online streaming, feel free to write things, answer things, and we'll see how it goes. Sound quality, I'm hoping, is okay. I'm just coming off the webcam rather than my normal microphone. And already I can see this has gone up to 72 degrees. You might hear it. You might hear extra levels of whirring in the background. I've currently got, sitting under the computer, a freezer pack in a desperate hope of trying to kind of keep it a bit cool, but it doesn't really seem to be doing much. So part of me is seriously distracted about the heating levels on this and whether we're just going to lose everything. Right, so if you can bear with me and my panic levels, let's just make a start on this and see how it goes, and hopefully it won't conk out too quickly. So let's see, what have we got? We've got comments here. Jim from Dumfries says, hi from a dark Dumfries. Yes, we're now past the solstice, not solstice, the equinox. It's definitely getting darker in the evenings. April says, hello everyone, hope all is well. Meg, that's my daughter, watching downstairs, says, hi, evening everyone. And Brian also says, hi from a dry Dumfries. So we know it's dry and dark in Dumfries at the moment. Roy from Yorkshire says, hello everyone. Rosemarie says, howdy from all from the Pacific Northwest, Washington State, USA. Robert says, howdy from Texas, looks good and sounds good. Well, that's nice to know. Fiji from India is saying, good evening, everyone. Stacy says, hey, good afternoon, everyone from Pennsylvania. James Nicole says, hi from Creetown. That's in the opposite direction to Dumfries from here. Who else have we got? Marina says, hello from a sunny Florida. Excellent. Rosemary says, a Zoom call would be fun. Not on this computer, it wouldn't. Roy says, sound is okay. And Meg saying, don't panic, you will do fantastic. Thank you. Nice little bit of reassurance from my daughter there. Okay, so far, looks like I've also had quite a few people sort of email me and message me saying, oh, I'm really sorry, can't make it tonight. But, we'll watch on catch up. But they're the ones who are missing out because they can't join in with the live typing. So great to know we've got probably about a dozen people here in live commenting, letting us know. So cool. Like I say, so the part of this now is I've scribbled down the questions that people sent. I've got them on a separate screen over there to go. And what I will do is I'll go through some of the questions that have been asked me. Then we'll go on to I'll ask you some questions, which you're free to. If you haven't sent me, you can have a think about and paste into the comments here. In fact, actually, for anybody who hasn't sent me an answer but would like to kind of think it, my first question, which I will come back to, you can have a little think about, is what is your most common camera mistake? What's the most common camera mistake that you make? So I'll chat a little bit. I'll explain one or two of the ones that I often find myself kind of having to suddenly deal with. Because it doesn't matter how long you've been using a camera, there are some things that just always seem to trip you up. And then I've got a few people sent in answers on that one. And if anybody else wants to throw in an answer into the chat here, please feel free. So questions for me, I said sent in some questions. Doriana started with, she actually sent me in one saying, when did I start in photography? And well, I mean, well, I am not. The answer to this is basically I'm a much more recent photographer. I'm not one. There are some photographers you meet and they, it was like when they were 4 years old, they got their first box brownie and they've been doing photography ever since. I haven't. I mean, I've had a camera for doing sort of family snaps, but it wasn't until probably about 15 years ago, I think, when I actually sort of picked up a camera in earnest. If you go back 15 years, my photos were as bad as anybody who never really takes photos. I could take a photo. If I was taking a photo of you, there's more chance the wall behind you would be in nice sharp focus, you would be out of focus. I might have my thumb halfway across the lens, I'd be cutting bits of your head off, it would look like a plant was growing out of your ear. All the same kind of things that everybody makes, same kind of mistakes everybody makes when you first start doing photography. But what happened with me was I started suffering from, well, what was eventually diagnosed as ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome. And at that point, when you feel like, that's really when I got into photography. There's a whole thing that goes on, and other people will be aware of this kind of feeling in other areas of their life, where when you feel like a chunk of your life has been taken out of your control, a very common reaction is to look for something where you do feel you have control over something. And for me, and this is really cutting the story down very short, photography became that. But I suddenly found that I could go out and by changing the angle, by changing the camera settings, by changing the lighting, suddenly I could change what happened in the back of the camera, and then I could take these images and I could load them onto the computer, and I could make more changes in our editing software. And essentially, I became obsessed with this. And over the next few years, I kept at it more and more. And if I wasn't taking photographs, I was reading books on photography, I was watching YouTube tutorials on photography. And then eventually, and then I got into portraiture, faces, and then essentially set up myself as a portrait photographer. It was a job I could create while I was dealing with the chronic fatigue. That essentially it becomes a case of, so mornings I tend to be better, afternoons are pretty much a write-off for me. So if somebody phoned and said, oh, could I book in for the afternoon? I said, terribly sorry, I'm busy. Can I book you in for 10 a.m. or something like that? And so I could sort of work my business around it. So that's kind of how I got into photography. And then it's just grown ever since. So hope that gives you an answer to that one. Right, okay, like I say, feel free to drop comments in, respond, bounce ideas about, however it sort of fits you best. Okay, another one here. This is a question from Roy. Roy says, I love good street photography, but my problem is taking photos of people without their knowledge. I usually end up asking permission, which is nearly always given, but then the subjects are posing, even though I tell them not to. Any suggestions for getting over this? That's a brilliant question, Roy. I think it is one of those serious problems with street photography. Now, I suppose there's different kinds of street photography. There's street photography, which in some ways is a bit like wildlife photography, where essentially, just like if you're photographing robins and chaffinches at your feeder, or squirrels in the trees, or brown bears in Alaska, essentially the wildlife is getting on with it. They're not really aware of you. You're not wanting them to be aware of you. You just take the photos, and what you're waiting for is for the wildlife and the background to move into the right place to give you the right composition, the right juxtaposition of light, composition, line, form, background, narrative. And if you're in the right place at the right time enough, or you click enough times, hopefully then you end up with a picture which makes you go, ooh, I like that. And a lot of street photography is very, very similar to that. Another slight variation on street photography is street portraits. And that's where you essentially go up to strangers in the street and say, hey, wow, I absolutely adore your hat, beard, scar, outfit, matching handbag, shoes. I love doing street portraits. Would you pose for me? Now, Roy, coming back to you then with what to do about taking photos of people. Either if you're going for street portraits, well, then you obviously have to interact. If you're trying to just sort of take random pictures of people on the street, like a kind of wildlife photography, if you stop and ask them, then yeah, that is going to be a problem. That they are actually going to change their behavior because they know a camera is pointing at them. And it's a really, really difficult one. One of the reasons I personally don't do street photography. I have huge admiration for people who do, but I don't do it because I like the interaction with people, and I also feel quite uncomfortable about the idea of taking photos of people when they're not aware of it. I've done it on occasion, but it's not my speciality. And I think really this is one of those things where it comes down to your personality. There are some amazing street photographers out there who really do just essentially they view other people like wildlife. And I think there's this kind of mental shift to do that. There's things about the law and where you have to be slightly careful. And there's also don't be a jerk about it either. If somebody sees you taking photos and goes, oi, I don't want my photo taken, delete the photo. Don't mess about. I mean, the law is on your side, as in if you are in a public space, you are allowed to take photos of somebody else in a public space. Now, you have to be careful. If you're setting up a tripod on the pavement, you can be done for obscuring rights of way. I've heard of people getting kind of not even as far as prosecuted, but being warned off on that by the police. But generally speaking, I think it's a kind of personality thing. I don't think there is a real answer. The simple fact is, if you interact with the people, they are going to change their behavior. And you either get that to work for you, which is, hey, would you pose for me? Or you essentially have to not ask them. And if that makes you feel uncomfortable, try a different form of photography. I don't think there's an easy solution to that. So anyway, I hope that kind of gives you a kind of bit of a background, to kind of an idea there, Roy. Okay, oh, I see VG's put in a question. Oh no, that's a response. That's a response to most common camera mistake. I'll come back to that one then. We'll do another one here. A question from Rosemary. It says, "What is something unexpected that photography has taught you, or a way that has benefited you in a way you wouldn't have predicted?" I should have thought about this one before I actually put it up. I was just busy copying and pasting questions in without actually necessarily thinking about them first. What is something unexpected that photography has taught me, or a way it's benefited me? I think the thing that I wasn't so aware of until I really got into photography, and particularly getting into portraiture, was the power balance and the power dynamics of photography. And what I mean by that is the person holding the camera is the person who has all the power. So if I have the camera and I'm pointing it at you, there's the possibility I could make you look amazing, I could make you look cool and iconic, or I could make you look absolutely ridiculous. And we all know this on some level. We all know the reason why so many people hate having their photo taken is because they've had so many bad photos taken of them. They've had so many photos taken of them when they weren't ready, when they didn't feel they had permission, when they were caught half blinking, or they were in the middle of talking, so their mouth was frozen at a funny angle. So essentially, click, off it goes, and put up on Facebook for 500 people to see. And inwardly, you just want to die because you feel like your image has been taken out of your control. Somebody else has taken control over it. And that power dynamic, I think, is something which is why so many of us feel really deeply uncomfortable about having somebody else take a photo of us, unless we've managed to learn to trust them. And in turn, learning that changed the way that I do portrait photography. My portraits, when I do portrait photography, what I will most often do, particularly if I'm indoors and near a power system, is I will tether my camera to the laptop or a tablet or something, so that when I take the photo, the client can instantly see the picture. And then that way, they know I'm not trying to pull a fast one on them. I'm not telling them they look great if they're not happy with it. But what I can also do is I can give them feedback, and I can show them what happens. I can say, well, look what happens if I turn the camera, tilt the camera this way. Look what happens if you lean forward, or I ask you to tilt your head or change your shoulders. Look what happens if we move the lighting around. And essentially, I train people in front of the camera. And after a while, they start to realize that I'm on their side. And that whole power dynamic, that whole idea of I come in and I impose photography upon them, begins to diminish. Now we become collaborators. We're working together to create a really interesting photo. And once you create that power, you equal out that power balance, then you get a much more relaxed and more engaged and interesting experience. So I think that was probably, and so that's sort of fed into everything I do since. So I would say that was probably the biggest surprise to me, and the thing in a way that I've benefited from most as well. So interesting question, that one, Rosemary. Thank you for asking. Okay, so let's throw in 72 degrees. It's sort of 71, 72. It's hovering around. We haven't overheated completely yet. So let's let's throw in this question. What is your most common camera mistake? I'll start off with mine. Well, it used to be ISO settings. I would totally and utterly forget to do the ISO settings. I would say a problem for me and it's one of these I have to watch out because I've been caught out with it once or twice before, and it's a horrific thing to suddenly discover. For me, it's the equivalent of leaving the lens cap on while you shoot the film. Now, we don't tend to do that in these days of digital photography because we take a look in the back of the camera, we can instantly see whether we've left the lens cap on. My problem has been sometimes most of the time, when the lens on my camera is set to autofocus, I don't fully trust my eyes to be able to manually focus to the pin sharp point that I want. And generally speaking, the autofocus is pretty good. I've got these little spots around, I can move the dial about, I can decide where on the screen I want it to focus. So I line it up using a little kind of mini joystick with my thumb on the back of the camera and then set the autofocus. But every now and again, I put it on manual focus because maybe the autofocus isn't doing what I want it to. It's just, and the nastiest thing for me is forgetting to put it back on autofocus. And I do remember once doing a shoot where I did the whole shoot, and the problem is in the back of the camera, you can't always tell what's in, your picture is only 2.5, 3 inches wide. It isn't showing you completely what's in focus. Something can kind of look in focus, but you don't know until you actually get back and you look at the pictures on the computer. And I got back, looked on the computer, and every single picture was out of focus because it was on manual and it was just sitting there. And I hadn't made any adjustments while I was shooting because I just assumed it was an auto and was adjusting it itself. And it was kind of close enough. It was a sort of mid-range focus that it seemed like it was probably in focus. And yet I get back and find everything, the person's face isn't in focus. The cushions behind them or the wall behind them or whatever, or something in front of them, those are in nice sharp focus, and the person wasn't. And that was just an absolute gut-wrenching moment of realization that I think out of the whole shoot, only half a dozen photos were in focus by accident. So having learned that the hard way, that's now one of these that I have to, but there have still been occasions when occasionally I have done a little photo. I've done the first sort of round, I started shooting and I suddenly realize that something's not quite right. And I've flipped over, but I've lost that first set of photos. So that's that. There you go. Confessions of a photographer. That's one for me. So what I wanted to know is what other kind of common camera mistakes do people make? So VG is saying, forgetting to adjust settings. Sometimes shutter speed will be slow. I forget to set only to realize after clicking, and it takes time to capture and my hands start shaking frustrated, and I'll switch it off and on. Oh, Rosie's here, says, hi, Kim and everyone. Apologies from the Isle of Whithorn. We had visitors. Hi, Rosie. Glad you could make it. So yeah, that one of getting the right shutter speed. I do sometimes find that if I've set the camera to timer, say a 2-second or a 10-second delay, and then I finish that and then go away. When I turn the camera on, I do my first click and then nothing's happening, and then suddenly I realize the timer's still going. I think it's one of these things which, again, through practice, through experience, you just you get to that point where you go, oh, okay, right, I've got to remember to make sure I've got the settings as I want them. Rosie says, I usually forget to change the metering mode. I tend to leave it on spot metering, and if I'm going for birds, etc., always forget to change for other scenes. Yeah, there are several different metering modes that you can have, and depending on what kind of photography you're doing, depends on which one kind of works best. Yeah, no, I recognize that one. I feel your pain there, Rosie. Other people have said, so Doriana said her most common mistake is shutter speed, so similar to you there, BG. Also taking pictures portrait instead of landscape, and certainly I remember that's one of these things we've talked before about, especially if you are used to taking photos on your mobile phone. That is very easy to do them in portrait mode. But if we're kind of exploring photography on screens, especially on laptops and stuff like that, there's awfully often a lot more to be found in doing landscape crops. So being aware of that's a good one. Jim said in response to this one, not using a high enough ISO for some images, resulting in underexposure or camera shake from too slow a shutter speed. A bit cautious, I might end up with grainy images. Okay, that's a really interesting one, Jim. That's that notion, and it's true. One of the things we tend to aim for with photography is to try and get as clear an image as we want, as undiluted, as pure as we can. And ISO settings, for those of you who do manual and have that option on your camera, is one of those things whereby a low ISO, like 100, that's kind of what we're all aiming for. That gives you the cleanest kind of image you can have. However, you can't go as low light your limitations. If the light is too low, you quite often 100 ISO is you've got to end up going a very slow shutter speed to compensate. And if something's moving, that might not be the best way to go. So if you want to have a 100 ISO and a faster shutter speed, you then end up having to go for a wide aperture. Your wide aperture, maybe you're already as wide as you can go. So sometimes the only way to cope with the low lighting conditions is to increase your ISO. But the offset of that is it makes it a noisy image. It's a grainier, it's a more degraded image. We've talked about this sometimes before. It's one of these things that will constantly crop up again and again. But sometimes we're so obsessed with trying to make sure we have a low ISO that our shutter speed goes too low. And the shutter speed being low means that just general handshake will cause a blurry image. And in those circumstances, you're better off having a sharper image with a higher ISO than a blurred image, because a blurred image you can't use. A sharper image you can use sometimes, and even if the ISO is higher. So, you know, I remember reading an article once before. I think it was talking about photographing, well, this guy was photographing rodeos, you know, where you've got like guys literally being, you know, thrown off a horse at high speed. And he said, you've got to have the high speed. You've got to be at 1,000th of a second or even higher. And if that means you have a high ISO, you have a high ISO, because a blurry image just isn't going to cut it. So yeah, that's one to understand. Rosemary says, currently it's not having a strong muscle memory for my new camera, so it takes me too long to set up for a shot. I also tend to underexpose. Yeah, I think, so much of it is experience. And it's the same thing if you change camera, upgrade your camera. I remember, you know, every time you get a new camera, it's where are all the buttons? And in essence, you just have to keep going at it. So you use the excuse, take a lot of photos of things, even if they're not overly, you know, you're not trying to go for the best image in the world, but just to get the practice in, you know. The more you do it, the more frequently you do it. And, you know, and the other thing is, don't take a photo, leave it for a week and then take another photo. Take photos every day if you can. And the more you use the camera, the more familiar it comes. If you think it's exactly the same as like driving, for anybody who's learned how to drive, remember especially if you, slightly different maybe in America where you drive a lot of automatics, but certainly in the UK where you mostly drive manual, and you're learning to drive and you're thinking, I've got to put my foot on the clutch, I've got to move this gear stick, I've got to check the mirror, I've got to indicate, I've got to turn the wheel, I'm supposed to do all this all at the same time. How on earth am I supposed to do it? And yet, of course, the more you drive, the more these things just become automatic. So same thing with the camera. Ben said one of his common problems is framing too tightly, so he doesn't have enough image to work with later. So that's the classic give it room to breathe that I will talk about. And yeah, I think that is, I sometimes I will talk about that notion of, it's that thing of, if you zoomed in as tight as you can and you need a little bit more, you can't add it on. If you've got a little bit more space, you can always crop in a little bit. But if you've already got in as far as you can't kind of extend out in the same way. I mean, you'll see on Photoshop, sometimes I can do a kind of autofill, and occasionally it works well on a little bit, but you're fairly limited, and you don't want to have to rely on Photoshop getting you out of it. Or I always tend to feel, just shoot just a little bit bigger than you think you need, and then that gives you the space to kind of crop in a little bit as you go. Okay, Stacy says here, someone told me the card speed tends to be a factor in photography. What is the best speed without spending a fortune? Card speed. Not entirely sure. I think that, I mean, I suppose some cameras and some memory cards might be a thing about how quickly that's more about how quickly you're taking your photo. I mean, if you're trying to do high speed photography, if you're trying to shoot 20 frames per second, then the speed at which the picture is being written onto your card can make a difference. But for most of us, most of the time, that's not really likely to be much of an issue. If you go click and then there's another couple of seconds before you go click again, it's not really going to be a problem, I don't think. Rosie says, is that the buffering speed? Yeah, pretty much. Yes, that's another term for it, buffering speed. It's, yeah, how quickly stuff is being written or it takes to. I mean, another thing with it, it's a bit like if you're using off-camera flash and you take a photo and the flash goes poof, a speed light, it flashes. There's a time for which it will take to recharge before you can shoot again. And quite often with anything that's, you whether it's writing onto cards or flashes going off, there can be that. But it only really tends to be a problem if you are doing things at speed. If you're doing it, and if you're likely to be out there doing high speed, shooting off lots of frames per second, then you're probably going to need a slightly more expensive camera to do that. Okay, Robert says, how many lenses should one have? How many can you afford? It's a bit like saying to a guitarist, how many guitars should you have? There is no should as such. It's a personal taste. It's a personal preference. I think sometimes, certainly, we can get caught up with the idea of buying way too many more than we need if we have the funds for it. If we don't have the funds for it, the number of lenses we have is dictated purely by our bank balance and our priorities. I think I have, well, my lenses, the ones I use, I've got my workhorse lens is a 24 to 70 millimeter range, 24 to 70. Then I have a 10 to 24, which is a wide angle. So basically, once you start going below 35 millimeters, you're moving into wide angle. So to get down to a 10, so 10 to 24, 10 to 22, that's wide angle. Then I've got my mid-range, which is 24 to 70. And then I've got my zoom, which is 70 to 200. So between three lenses, I can go from 10 millimeters to 200. And those are the ones that I use most of the time. Other lenses I've got, I then have a macro lens, my 100 millimeter prime macro lens. And that allows me to do macro, which none of those other lenses do. And then I have the nifty 50, a little 50 millimeter lens, which I bought way back when I was starting, nice little prime lens. And occasionally I still use it for portraits because there is something quite nice. It is a nice lens. So that's 5 lenses I have. And I feel I can justify all the lenses that I have. But there are some people, but then if you were doing street photography, that might require a particular kind of lens. Rosie, we know, has her 600 millimeter lens for doing super zoom, being able to get the individual strands on a feather of a chaffinch at 500 yards. So a lot depends on the kind of photography you're doing. If you're not going to be doing that kind of wildlife photography at a distance or sports photography, where you're trying to get somebody close-up facial expression as they're doing the touchdown 100 yards away, then do you need a lens like that? So I tend to kind of feel you don't want to have too many, because then you end up with option overload. And so often I go out to photo shoots, and it's like I'm not sure what, and I end up packing loads, and then I'll only end up just using the camera that was already sitting on the lens, because when it's there you adjust to it. So I think that's a kind of a thing to remember. Is really I think there's no point in overdoing it. If there's a particular lens which it's only that lens will do it for you, and you really want it and you can afford it, then fine, go for it. But I don't tend to. I think there's never. What's the real point of having 40 lenses? And then every time you go out, having option overload and just not knowing which ones you're going to take, and then end up taking you have to buy a trailer to fit them all on. So anyway, there's no right or wrong answer in that one, I think, and it's another one that kind of comes down to your personality. Okay, what else have we got here? Well, actually, there was one back here from Rosemary who's replying to my take on the power balance thing that I was talking about with photography, which is a very interesting take on the power balance and how you were able to even out this even that out to support to support the you provide your subjects with. I bet they appreciate that. Well, it's the appreciation comes in the results. There's an element whereby there's a necessity. If I want to take photos of people where they don't look like they're a rabbit in the headlights, or there's their eyes are kind of okay but their lips are really tight, there's tension there, then I have to relax them. And so over the years I've learned these ways to relax people. It's not it's not without feeling. It's not just purely a practical thing. There's a reality. I like people to feel relaxed in front of me. You have a better set conversation. It's just a nicer way of being. Building trust with people. If I want people to trust me, I have to be genuine. You can't really fake that. I enjoy being with people. I enjoy making them relax. I enjoy having the conversations. And so everything about, so again, this idea of portrait photography suits me because that's my kind of personality. There's plenty of people who struggle with other people, who can, or deal with other people for a certain amount of time, and then they get very tired with it. So these are probably not the best people fitted to portraiture. So an awful lot of these kind of things do come down to your personality. What else have we got here? Yeah, Robert says, okay, how long is a piece of string? Yep, exactly like that. Right, where are we? April says, I have a question. Okay, what is the terminology for photographers who shoot photography with little to no editing? Painters have a name for this. I hope this question makes sense. Okay. Yeah, in essence, I suppose the one that I hear, the one that I've had thrown at me once or twice, entered into friendly debate, is in-camera photographers, an in-camera photographer. And the idea with that is that you take the photo and you've done it in camera. There is no editing. It's as it comes out of the camera, that is your photo. Now, I have had debates before when I've had an open studio session. I've had visitors come around, even once or twice, like giving talks, and I've had somebody come up to me calling themselves an in-camera photographer with a sense of superiority, as though, and really essentially the whole point tends to be, I've taken everything inside this camera, that's what the photo is. Anything you do after that is messing about with it. It's no longer photography, it's editing, in a very dismissive kind of way. Now, first of all, don't get me wrong, if somebody wants to just photo, see what they can achieve with the camera and without any form of editing, and they get a kick out of that, and they are learning to master that, then that's fine. I have huge respect for that, no problem whatsoever with it. Where I had the problem was with the people who were essentially trying to lord it over me, as though they had some kind of pure access to free range, biodegradable light photography, earth friendly, whereas mine was chemically additive, nasty, corporate edited photography or something, my feeling is editing is a good thing. Learn to edit because my analogy is always like, if a poet comes out with an idea and scribbles a load of sentences onto a piece of paper, would you say the first draft is the most authentic? And I would say no. Nearly every poet you will ever talk to will tell you that you put down your first draft, then you go in and you edit it, and you tidy it up, and you clean it up, and you swap sentences about, and you change the grammar, and you swap these words about. Your first thing is almost like a thumbnail sketch. The editing is there to get it to a point whereby it really tells the story you want it to tell. Now, as a photographer, we want to get as much in camera as we possibly can, because that gives us maximum flexibility for our editing. Maybe our editing might be quite minimal, but if we want to do more, we can do more if we've got a good starting point in the camera. So always do the best you can in camera, but I think the editing is about polishing it up, is about tidying it up, is about so that the story you are trying to evoke or to communicate with your viewer gets across in the best way that it possibly can. In the same way that if you're writing, you need to get the right word. Why do thesauruses exist other than to help people find the right word? You know, you learn, or why do you use grammar? Why would you sometimes use a colon as opposed to a comma? It's to make sure that what you're trying to get across has the maximum amount of impact and really gets across the tail. And it's the same thing, I think, with photography. You know, one of the bits that I always go on about with photography is what story are you trying to communicate at the point you take that photo? And you do everything you can in camera to maximize the effect of that. And then when you take it back onto your computer, learn to edit so that you can polish it up better. Slightly different if you're doing particular kinds of documentary photography, you know, where something has to look exactly like it absolutely is. But if you're doing art photography, if you're doing storytelling photography, then you need to be able to have the maximum amount of impact with your images you can, at which point I think the editing is perfectly acceptable. So in-camera photographer, I think, is the long way around of going around saying that. Hope that answers you, April. Okay, Roy, referring to the lenses, says less is more. The fewer lenses you have, the more pictures you take. Quite possibly, because otherwise you spend all your time trying to decide what lens you've got. Stacey says, which do you prefer? Does a wide angle put more into a camera? I went somewhere called Steel Racks. It's very long. It's in a steel mill. I had to take it in sections. Well, the lens you use is entirely down to the shot you are shooting. If you are inside a big steel mill, then yeah, a wide angle lens is probably going to be best for you. But if you're trying to take a photo of a small bird at the other end of the garden where you don't want to get too close, then a wide angle is going to be pointless because it will be so small in the picture that you will never get any detail. At that point, you need a big zoom lens. If you are taking a photo of a person, you need a mid-range lens if you're doing a headshot, because a wide angle will distort the features, and a zoom lens means you will have to stand so far away from them in order to take the photo that you're kind of losing the connection you have with them in order to get that to the photo. So that's all about choosing the right lens for the kind of photo that you're doing. So I hope that makes sense. Where are we? Okay. Roy says every picture is edited. Either you do it yourself or you let Mezers, Canon, Nikon, etc. do it. And the point there is that Roy's making is when you take a photo and it saves it as a JPEG, there are already algorithms essentially built into the saving of the picture so that it's creating a particular color shift or there's a whole kind of technical editing thing going on even before you start. There is no such thing as a kind of pure unadulterated photo as such. The nearest you get to that is your raw file, but your raw file tends to be fairly dull. Your raw file is designed to then be edited. But if you're shooting in JPEG, then actually it's already been essentially edited just by the system. Right. Oh, Max here says, sorry, I'm late. Her indoors tried to cook the kitchen. I'm not going to go there, but welcome, Mac. Okay. Vici says, very well said. Rosie says, I like the poet analogy. I will try to remember that. Okay. Jim says, I suppose when film cameras were more common, in-camera photography would be more common. Well, that's certainly true. I mean, at the point where not everybody has a dark room, you tend to, stick with it. But again, if you're talking about the professional photographers who are making their living doing this, those are the people who will be more likely to have a dark room or work very, very closely with a printer, somebody who did the prints for them and would interact with them a lot. April says, oh no, I didn't mean it that way. I was just wondering if there was a term for it, like impressionist artists, etc. No, like I say, it's pretty in-camera photographer tends to be pretty much about it. Max says, I always run my images through Lightroom first. Yeah, it all depends where you're wanting to go. Okay. So that was the. So we've had some questions there. Questions from you. We've already done the what's your most common camera mistake. So let's okay. Another question I've got here from Jim. Now, how am I doing here? Oh, it's gone up to 73, 72 degrees. For those of you who've come in late, I am running on a 10-year-old laptop with overheating problems, and I'm watching this temperature gauge, worrying that sooner or later this whole thing is going to collapse and burn out. So if I disappear, it's quite probably because of that. How's the... Yep, this is starting to melt. Still fairly cold though. I will keep it underneath the camera. I've also got this my laptop at the moment is sitting on a cake tray that high off the desk to try and make sure there's more air circulating underneath it. All right, okay. Oh, what's the word? Oh, Robert said, Max says shooting raw. Robert says Lightroom and Camera Raw in Photoshop are essentially the same thing. Photoshop gives you more editing options. Oh, Maggie showing me another. I'll hold it back for the moment. I think I'm okay. Thank you. Maggie was just showing me, says we've got another freezer thing. If this starts melting too quickly. Yeah, maybe give that 10 minutes, Maggie. Thank you. Right, okay, so Jim says, we question about off-camera speed lights. Do you set them as slaves to your main light, e.g. your main light box, or do you use a remote trigger from your camera? Also, how do you know what power setting to use for the remote flashes? Is it a case of trial and error, or do you work it out somehow? Thinking of particularly photo shoots I've done. Okay, so what we're talking about here is, for those of you who've seen some of my photo shoots where I've got off-camera flashes, sometimes more than one off-camera flash. There's a number of different ways you can do it, and a certain amount depends on the equipment that you've bought. Now, for me, what I've got a little trigger. I've got a trigger on the camera. I then have the other triggers sit on the flashes so that when I go click, it automatically triggers the flashes to go off where I want them. Now, the power settings that I have on the flashes is trial and error to an extent. There's a certain amount where experience over time has told me I should probably set these at full power or half power or whatever, depending on the distance from where I am and how wanting the lights to balance. Now, if you're prepared to fork out more money for it, and it's just I've never quite upgraded that far yet. It's probably just a matter of time. But you can get much more sophisticated things whereby you can have essentially like a little box on top of your camera and adjust the power settings for all the different lights that you've got. So from your camera, you can say, right, light 1 is going to be at half power, light 2 is going to be at 1/8 power, light 3 is going to be at full power. And then you can go click, you can look in the back of your camera, and then you can make little adjustments. You don't have to get up and go round and then manually dial them. Really useful. It's just that if you are having one of those boxes, you have to have the matching triggers, and essentially you end up spending quite a lot of money. When I started using off-camera flashes, I went for a more basic setup where I just had basic triggers and then manually adjusted them. And so far, I'm kind of still okay doing that. If I get to a point whereby it's no longer serving or it's just taking too much of my time to be able to do that, at that point I will then look into upgrading. So it's kind of down to you, down to your budget, down to how much you want to play around with it. So hope that answers that one, Jim. Right. Oh, Jackie's here. It says, I thought you were starting an hour later as your new time slot. It's always been 7:30 UK time. Now, in a couple of weeks' time, in 2 or 3 weeks' time, I'll have to work it out, and I will give you warnings. The clocks go back as we move from British summertime to Greenwich Mean Time, at which point there will be an hour shift. I can't remember whether it will be, for those who are out with the UK, whether that will be like, it will be an hour later or an hour earlier. Might even depend on which side of whether you're east or west from here. But no, sorry, Jackie, we're already here. Okay, and Max says, I use triggers 3 max and manually adjust them as well. Oh, Jackie says she'll play catch up tomorrow. Jim says, thanks for your answers. Cool. Okay, right. What other questions have we got here? Doriana says, here's some, what's the best advice you were given when you started? Ooh, what was I best given when I started? I think part of the problem is I don't remember really being given much advice because I kind of went into it myself. I mean, it's partly why I do this podcast, to be able to give advice, because I know what it was like when I was starting out. And most of my advice was I kind of just, it was me grabbing information wherever I could. I think probably the most important thing was to learn fairly early on was it's okay to not get it right first time. And some of you will have heard me talk about this before, but it's definitely worth repeating, which is we learn from our mistakes. We learn from all the things that go wrong. The things that go right, we don't really tend to learn much from. When it goes right, we already know it. Now, when things go right, that's when we get the praise, and the praise is lovely. And for a lot of us, that's what we're chasing. We want people to tell us how wonderful we are, how wonderful our picture is, how well we've done. We want that little tick that we got in school for turning in our homework and getting it correct. We're terrified of the cross that tells us we got it wrong. But we don't really learn from getting it right. We learn every time we make it, because when you take a photo and you look in the back of the camera and it's pish, it's just, this isn't good, this isn't what I wanted, you then have to figure out how to get it better. What do I have to do? What camera settings do I need to change? What lighting do I need to change? What angle do I need to change? What do I need to do in order to get this better than it currently is? And that's the learning process, and that's how you then come to master photography. And it's about not being afraid of getting it wrong. It's also understanding that, even when you need super top level, highest level photographers, the ones who are putting a picture on the front of Vogue magazine, they still took 400 photos and chose the best one to go on the magazine. That everybody who's sticking photos up out there, especially those who are serious amateurs, the semi-pros, the professionals, absolutely. You also have to remember is everybody's putting up their best work. For every one photo that I put up online, there will be hundreds of photos that I've taken that didn't go up online because they weren't as good. I took whatever level of photos, I chose the best photos of the ones that I got in camera, I edited them up to as best as I could, and then I put them online. The problem for the rest of us is when we look at what other people are doing, they just put up good photos and we assume that they didn't take any bad photos. We think that somehow, oh, they must be a great photographer. I'm a terrible photographer because I've taken all these bad photos. They've taken loads of bad photos. They just haven't put them up online. And if they never took a bad photo, they wouldn't have learned how to improve. They wouldn't have gained. They wouldn't have learned anything. And they'd have got bored and gone off and done something else. So don't believe the hype. Don't understand that you are looking at the best polished up version of somebody's 400 photos, that they put that one up every time you're looking at somebody else's photo. And I think learning that and understanding that was a huge thing for me. It's probably one of the most useful things for me to understand. It wasn't, the most useful thing isn't how to adjust your aperture settings, though of course that's important. The best thing for me to learn was that conceptual thing, so that I wasn't beating myself up every time and sometimes you can go out and you can take, fill your card full and you still end up with no photos, don't have a decent photo. But you still learned from the process, and next time you go out, you're more likely to get the good photo. So I think that's probably, I would say, the best piece of advice for starting out. Okay, what else have we got here? Max said in terms of his most common mistake, that's forgetting to put his SD card still in the camera bag, not in the camera. James says take test shots if possible. April says thanks for all your help. Excellent. Max says we all take more than we need. The work starts when you're trying to find the best one. Cool. Okay, excellent. So where else have we got to? Oh, Rosemary says, cropping. At what point do images become so small as to become degraded? I'm trying to avoid cropping too extremely as I tend to shoot tight, often without giving enough breathing room. Maybe I'm being overly cautious. Okay. So what I understand from what you're saying here, Rosemary, is the idea of, yeah, we've talked about this before sometimes when people have had a picture that's this big and then they cropped in to this size, and when it fills your screen, it's just not there. You don't have the detail. There's a certain amount really here, I would say, of common sense. Part of it is to do with, well, try a little bit of trial and error. If you're starting off with your pictures this big, you can probably crop into there and you're okay. You can probably crop into there and you're kind of okay. Once you start getting into here, you've lost half your information. You've only got half the same, if you've gone from a 4,000 pixel, 4,000 by 3,000 pixels making up that, and you've cropped it down so you've got 2,000 by 1,500, you're actually a quarter the size. You've lost 3/4 of the information. Because you've lost 3/4 of the information, you've now got a lot less to be able to work with. Now, if that picture is only ever going to go on the web, and actually that bit contains everything you need and you don't have to do a lot of editing to it, then you can get away with that. If you need to then print that up so it's going to go on the side of a bus promoting the latest whatever, you can't. So part of the answer to this one then is really I've already advised shoot slightly bigger than you need so that you have cropping options. But you don't want to shoot so wide that by the time you've cropped in, you've lost half the picture. There isn't a definitive answer on this other than, as a general rule, you want to have as much information in the picture, the original picture, as you can, so that you don't have to crop too much. With the proviso that you haven't already gone in so close that actually you've missed information that you needed to have in there in order to make the picture work. So to a certain extent, Rosemary, it's trial and error, and it's getting to learn, and it's making mistakes. It's making the mistakes and going too far and realizing actually that really doesn't work. I better not do that again. So I think a lot of photography is understanding your aim. Your aim is to fill the lens with as much of the picture as you can. And then you have little extra bits, say, well, I'll shoot from a little bit wider so I've got the options to crop if I need to. Your aim is to have a 100 ISO picture, because then when you come to editing, there's no noise in it. It's as pure and sweet as it can be. But that's on the proviso that there's no point in having a 100 ISO photo if it's ended up being blurred because you couldn't get your shutter speed high enough, or it's just too dark. You've underexposed and you've lost too much information. So you have your aim. Your aim is, 100 ISO. Your aim is fill the lens, but you have to take into consideration the circumstances under which you're taking the photo as well, and then adjust to it. And how far you can adjust is, depends on the photo you've got, the circumstances you've got, and each thing kind of comes individually on its own level. So hope that makes sense. Okay, now connected to this idea of cropping in a way, Brian from Dumfries has also sent in and said, "Hi Kim, could you explain the relevance between a full frame sensor and a crop sensor and the advantages for each sensor?" Okay, I've got a scrap of paper. This is probably not. I should have thought this one through. Okay, so some of you will have heard of the difference between a crop sensor and a full frame sensor, and you can buy full frame cameras and crop sensor cameras, although they don't tend to call them crop sensor. You have cameras and then you have full frame cameras, and essentially it is about the size of the sensor which is in the camera, so that when you go click and the shutter opens and the light comes in, it hits the sensor, records the information, saves that information to the card. That's what's giving you your picture. Now, a full frame sensor is the full size sensor. So a crop it's smaller. It's kind of cropped in. So do I have a picture? Okay, let's just randomly take this picture, right? So here we have a picture. Now, if this was taken on a full frame camera, that's your whole picture. If I was standing in exactly the same place with a crop sensor, I would maybe only fit something like that amount in. I don't know whether you can see that. Okay, so it's a crop sensor. It's cropped in from the bigger sensor. So all cameras that are not full frame cameras, or nearly all cameras for working purposes, virtually all cameras that don't call themselves full frame cameras are crop sensor cameras. So essentially you're starting with a smaller point. Now, advantages, disadvantages. The obvious advantage to having a full frame camera is, first of all, you fit more in. Secondly, because you've got a bigger sensor, it tends to operate much better in low light conditions. If you consider that you're trying to get as much light onto the sensors as you can, it helps if you have a bigger sensor. If you've got a tiny sensor, it's like on your phone. This might have 23 megapixels, but the sensor on it is tiny. So the quality of each pixel is never going to be as good as the quality on a larger camera. So you get more to your camera. You get it works better in low light conditions. Generally speaking, your full frame will give you a better quality. As such, why does anybody have a crop sensor? A couple of different reasons for that. First is price. A full frame sensor is more expensive than a crop sensor, so they can produce the crop sensors cheaper and mass produce, send them out much more easily. So you're more likely to sell things. Added to that is then the size of your camera. So in order to fit a larger sensor, you have to have a bigger camera. So the bigger camera then becomes heavier. Now that's fine for professional photographers who are using tripods and all this kind of stuff. But if most people are leaping around and want a little portable camera, maybe a camera they can slot in their pocket, or maybe one that they can have over their shoulder, but that wrists aren't going to start aching if they use it for any length of time, then these people, you then want a smaller camera. You don't want a big heavy camera. So the crop frame helps with that. You might not do quite as well in the low light conditions, but you're offsetting it with the fact that it's more portable. There is another advantage, which is if you look at this in a bit, essentially you're zoomed in. You're already zoomed in more than if you've got the full part. Now, if you are taking, so a lot of crop sensors, a lot of crop sensors are roughly give you the equivalent of a zoom of about 1.5-ish times. It varies from camera to camera. I think Canon's are 1.6, Nikon's are 1.5, some Sony's are even 2. But what it means is so it's a bit like if I have a 50mm lens on my camera, it's got a focal length, or not focal length, the kind of zoom length is essentially taking a picture, or that's like it's a 75mm. If I have a 200mm, it's like having a 300mm lens on. So it allows you to shoot further. Now, the contrary to that is wide angle. You can't go as wide angle. When you've got a full frame lens, you can go much more wide angle with it. So that's kind of what it comes down to, Brian, is that your full frame, by and large, tends to be a better quality sensor. You'll work better in low light. You've got more pixels, you've got more space, everything's better to play with. Your quality is generally going to be better, but they're more expensive. The cameras tend to be bigger. And the advantage of the crop sensor is it's cheaper, it's more flexible, and you get an added bonus of the fact that you kind of already zoomed in a little bit more. So now, if you want more than that, Google it. And there's probably lots more subtleties to that. But as a kind of quick answer, I hope that kind of makes it a bit clear for you, Brian. Okay. What else have we got? Oh, April says, any tips for low level photography? Now, do you mean low level as in keeping your camera low to the ground, or do you mean low light photography? Answer me that one, April, and I'll come back to you, because there's two different kinds of explanations. Okay, Brian says thanks for that. Good. Okay, where are we at? Still at 73. If that flickers to 74 again, I think I might ask Maggie to bring through another cold box. Right. Oh, yes. Okay, so April says low level ground. Okay, so tips for low level ground photography. Well, that all depends on what it is you're kind of wanting to photograph. Your main thing is you're not wanting to ruin your camera, so you kind of have to be careful as to what surface you're putting it on. You know, if it's going to sink into the mud, obvious kind of things like that, or if you're putting it on a really abrasive surface or hard concrete floor, you've got to very gently place it. Part of the problem, if you're sitting it directly at ground level, is quite often into the shot, half your shot gets taken up with the level that it's on. You know, if you're on the road itself is taking up. So sometimes what you might want to do is just raise it slightly. I mean, one of the things I do on occasion, if I've got the camera down at ground level, is I will actually have the lens cap. I will tuck the lens cap under the lens just to lift it a fraction. Having something in your pocket, a pen, a cigarette lighter, anything like that you happen to have, if you put it under the lens at the far end, the tip of the lens, or even move it back just a bit from the tip, you will find that you can just angle the camera up a little bit, which, if it's actually sitting on the ground, gives you a little bit more of what you're going for. Another thing about ground level photography, the biggest problem that you've got is really necessarily being able to see through the viewfinder. If you've got a proper camera, you know, the kind of camera where you look through a viewfinder, you can't always get your head down far enough, because depending on how big your camera is, you might have your head on the floor, but your eye isn't still actually reaching the viewfinder. Or maybe you don't want to have your head on the actual floor because it's mucky. This is where sometimes, well, if you've got a view screen in the back, that's helpful. The best ones are the ones where you have the screen which comes out and you can angle up, because then you can have it on the floor, you can angle the screen up, and then you can actually still see what's going on. Not every camera has that, so a certain amount depends on the kind of camera you've got as to whether you can do these things. But primarily, the main thing you're thinking of, other than can you still see through it, is you want to be thinking about, can you angle it, and how easily can you angle it when it's at ground level, and also just making sure that you're not actually doing any damage to the camera by the surface it's on. Does that help, April, or is there something else you're wanting to know about that, or are you talking conceptually rather than on a practical level? If you let me know. Okay. Right, Jim says, get on your belly, April. Yeah, oh, yeah, you might get messy. That's the big problem. Yes. Take a mat with you wherever you go, I think, is the answer. Okay, I'll tell you what then. Let's move on to another question here, which I have for you, which is fantasy landscape. Where would you most like to photograph, and why? If you could get the opportunity to go to any kind of landscape area, what would you like to photograph the most? And for me, I suppose there's two. I mean, I'm not a landscape photographer naturally. I'm a people photographer first, but there's the first is where I have already been and I would now love to go back to, which is desert. Coming up to 5 years ago, I had the most wonderful opportunity to spend to go out to the Sahara, Western Sahara in Morocco. Camel ride for a couple of hours out to a campsite where you camp overnight, watch the sunrise over the desert, and then camel ride a couple of hours back. Very, very touristy kind of thing to do, but oh my God, it was amazing. It was wonderful. It was one of these just incredible experiences. And that's one where I was going to Morocco. It was a really tight fit for the flight we were going on. I wasn't going to be able to take a big camera bag with me. I just decided to take one lens, and I took a wide angle lens with me. And whilst I managed to get certain shots, which I'm really proud of, when I was there as the sun was rising, I realized that essentially I had the wrong lens for the I really should have had a mid-range lens. I would have been happier with my 24-70 than I would have with the 10-22 to get the kind of shots that I had in my head at the time. So I would love to get the chance to go back to the desert, but with the lenses that are, the lens that I really wanted. The other option, Iceland. I keep seeing people coming back from Iceland with the most incredible landscape, black sands and craggy mountains and overcast clouds and dramatic kind of, so Iceland I think is the other one. So I put this question, what fantasy landscape, where would you like to be? A few people answered. Roy said, my photo hero for a long time has been Ansel Adams, and I would love to trace his footsteps through Yosemite National Park and photograph Half Dome and some of his other iconic works. And yeah, I think that notion of sometimes we're really attracted. If we see photos that somebody else who we really respect has done, it gets really exciting, the idea of going off and seeing see if you can recreate or do your own version of, a modern version of what somebody was doing 60-70 years ago. Jim says, a white sandy beach as found on the northwest coast of Scotland and Ireland. Never had the opportunity to visit such places. The beaches around here are a bit dull in comparison. Dull or different? I think they're different. I think it always feels, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, as they say. There's always this feeling that, what we get attracted to is the exotic, is the not local. We've maybe photographed, been to the local beaches, we photograph the local beaches. Round here in this corner of Scotland, there's a lot of variation in beaches. You go to somewhere like Sandy Hills and big broad sands. There's the salt marshes. Around there, Claverack, you have the rocky cliff tops. There's lighthouses sitting out on rocky edges, like down at the Whithorn, beyond the Isle of Mull of Rosy Nose. Anyway, over there's the coast, the southwest coast of Scotland is full of a real variety of sea fronts as such. So lots of different kinds of things to go. But yes, those pure white sands of the sands of the northwest coast of Scotland, out in the Outer Hebrides, and I understand why you would want to do them. I think I really quite like to have a go at those ones as well. Brian says, I would love to photograph the Northern Lights. Yep, that sounds. Oh, and Jim says that would be a good idea, Brian. Club trip. Yeah, that sounds like. But I would love to. Yeah, I have photographed the Northern Lights. Well, not like you see them in these Norwegian or Icelandic kind of things, but every now and again the Northern Lights have made their way down as far as southwest Scotland. Quite often, the light isn't strong enough for you to really see it much by eye, but if you've got your camera on a slow enough exposure, it will pick out some of them. What else have we got here? Stacy says, I really enjoy ocean or mountains to photograph. And what else have you got here? April says, yes, I was curious. Agree. Thanks for telling me about the lens the items you can lean on and tipping it up slightly. Yeah, you'll certainly find that one useful. Mull of Galloway, that's it. Yes, says both Rosie and Jim. Yes, the Mull of Galloway, there's lighthouse on the end. So yes, that's what I was really trying to refer to. Stacey says, lighthouses are beautiful, lots in New England, Maine and Massachusetts. James says, I've been lucky enough to photograph the beaches of Uist, Harris and north of Scotland, but I love my muddy backyard. Excellent. Brian says the Murray Coast beaches are fantastic to see. You should see the aurora from there as well. Excellent. And yeah, James adds his on to out on Wigtown Bay. Cool. Um, right, what else have we got here? Oh, Doriana says, I would love to photograph water landscapes. I love spending time by the water. It's very relaxing. Rosemary says, the Palouse, I think, hills of Washington State, where the state's wheat is grown. This was my grandfather's favorite area to photograph, and I've inherited his appreciation for its beauty. Its open skies, rolling hills make the morning and evening light absolutely stunning. It also has an abundance of dilapidated grain mills and fascinating old barns. The area represents limitless opportunities for every taste, from minimalism to expansive panoramas, so offers opportunities to practice in a variety of styles. It changes dramatically with each season too. The Palouse is only 5 hours away, so I really have no excuse for not spending time over there. That sounds pretty amazing there, Rosemary. Yeah, so if you do get back over there, make sure you send us photos, let us know. Give us a sense of what that landscape is like. April agrees with Stacey about the lighthouses. Right, what else have we got here? Oh, Ben says, fantasy landscape. I enjoy the big and the bleak. At the weekend, I was at a bird reserve not far from where Kim lives. Would that have been Claverick, possibly? In a hide looking out over miles of salt marsh towards the sea, with low cloud. The Scottish word for the weather, dreich, captures the mood of the place. That's D-R-E-I-C-H. Dreich is a lovely Scottish word, and it is basically, it's dull, overcast, a bit gloomy, melancholic perhaps, a little bit of smur in the air. Smur, of course, being another Scottish word, is very kind of possibly, fine, not quite, it's not quite rain, but it's definitely, or drizzle, but it's a kind of fine mist, but a little bit more than mist. Smur is its own word. But dreich, yeah, kind of dull, yeah. But anyway, he goes on to say, it was magnificent. I'm intrigued how one might take pictures of dreichness without the pictures ending up just dull. That's a tricky one, because essentially what you're talking about is he's talking about being out on the salt marshes, big plains, big sky, but overcast, grey. There is a wonderful kind of mood to that. But how do you capture it without it just being dull? Now, this is where I really would need to kind of talk to landscape photographer friends of mine. But I think the thing here is, what you've got to think about here is back to the what's the story. What are you trying to capture? And there's different ways you can do this. Dreich you can capture close up just by the, zooming. You can have a flower or even a dead piece of bracken. If you get the lines and the light right, with the grey sky behind it and a dampness on the withered leaves, get the composition right, get the composition and the light right, and you can capture that kind of that moodiness to it. In terms of the expanse, I think, you can think minimalist, allow for the big sky, allow for the big, but you need to then have an object in it which just contrasts, whether it's it's a bird or a flock of geese flying just into it's something, creating a line that's breaking up that. So think minimalist, or think semi-abstract, really. I mean, go abstract in some ways, play around. I think it's that notion of, you're telling a story, and sometimes fiction tells a better story than the facts. And photography by its nature is fiction. The moment you decide to photograph this angle rather than that angle, you have made an editing choice, and you decided to leave out certain bits of information. There is no absolute truth in photography. Whoever said the camera never lies was lying through their teeth. The camera is incapable of telling the truth in a literal sense. It's 2 dimensions, not 3. It's always limited from where it was taken, and it's taken from a single fraction in time, as opposed to the way we experience time, which is running through it. But you can tell fantastic stories through fiction, and the camera is a storytelling instrument. So as such, you look for ways that you can tell the story. And if you need to go abstract, if you need to go minimalism, if you need to find particular details, remove certain other ones, I would say that's where you want to start playing and really investigate what other photographers have done, but also investigate what the painters have done, investigate the painting artists and see how they've set about. And also even those who do abstract or abstract landscapes, and see and be inspired by how other people have approached this, and allow that to feed into your photography, and then play and just try it out. Do, you know, go for the wide angle lens and take in the expanse of it, or use your macro to zoom in on something like, to say, like a withered but damp bracken spiral or something like that. Just, you know, these kind of things I think are the place to go. So hope you find that one useful, Ben. Right, okay, how are we doing? Right, 10 to 9, we are kind of moving on a bit. Still got a few more. What else have we got here? Oh, something I forgot to say from the beginning, which I should probably have said, and I will certainly say now, which is, if you happen to find these podcasts useful, interesting, helpful, entertaining, then you can always support them with buymeacoffee.com. Now, because I don't have the frame, because we're doing this in these kind of strange circumstances on this overheating laptop, oh, it's gone up to 77. Maggie, if you are there, could you please bring me through another cool box thing? That's getting dangerously high in temperature. Yeah, so I can't point to the bit on the screen that says buymeacoffee.com, but straightforwardly buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is the place to do it. Maggie, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Oh, that's cold. Excellent. Right, now, can I even slot that on top of that one? Tell you what, I will just lift that, I'll stick that there and actually balance that on top of there. And I hope we'll see whether that works. Thank you, Maggie. Oh, this laptop is driving me insane. Hopefully we will be back to normal next week. All right, okay. So another question here. How do you know when you've got something good when you're taking a photo? Yeah, this was a fun one. Actually, what I realized is when I'm out taking photos, I know I'm onto something because I start taking a lot more. Suddenly, you know, I'm taking a click here, looking at the back of the camera, click here, move there, move that. And then suddenly I think, oh, I'm onto something. And I will take a whole load of photos, more or less from exactly the same position. And part of it's because I'm terrified of getting back and finding that they were all out of focus, or the lighting wasn't quite right, or I missed something. So when I really want to get something, I take as many photos of it as I can, and I can maybe make subtle changes, and so I can be sure that when I get back to the computer, I've got something that works. So yeah, that's that point where suddenly there's almost like, before I even consciously realize I'm getting excited, my trigger finger starts getting faster. I start taking a lot more photos. What's April saying here is, do you enjoy abstract nature photography yourself? Like the idea of observing artists who paint abstract nature? Yeah, I think there's, like I said, there's an element whereby photography in its nature is already partially abstract. You can have fun. I've shown before, maybe I will show it again. I can't do it at the moment. But one of the things you get, one abstract way of playing with photography is in-camera movement, sometimes abbreviated to ICM, in-camera movement, which is where what you do is you put on, say, a slower shutter speed, say half a second or something like that. And as you press the shutter, you deliberately jerk the camera, you move it. Now, if you are, say you're in a forest with a bunch of trees all pointing upright, if you go click, click like that with the camera, then what happens is everything blurs. It blurs in line with the trees. And then you can get some really interesting, so you can still see all the colors of the trees. You've still got the shape of the trees, except everything's kind of got a movement focus in it. Another one is where you can move side to side. You can sort of pan. And I've sometimes seen, actually I've seen beach and sea photos done like this, where you click and you move, but you've got to be absolutely perfect with your horizontal, so you keep your horizon straight. But then the clouds and the beach and everything else have these kind of streaks going across them. So you can have literal abstract fun with things like that. So that's one to play around with. But yeah, Google these things. Look up abstract photography, abstract landscapes, abstract artists, and see what comes up, and then sort of use it as a launch point to go and play. What else have I got here? Oh, Maggie says, do you prefer shooting indoors or outdoors? Well, that obviously depends on what I'm photographing. But I suppose what immediately leaps to my mind when you're talking about the difference between indoors and outdoors for me is, for the most part, if I'm shooting indoors, I'm using artificial lighting. Very rarely is indoors giving me enough light to achieve what I'm setting out to do. Whereas if I'm shooting outdoors, I'm much more likely to be using natural available daylight. Now, obviously, there's overlap with both. Sometimes I'm indoors and there's a beautiful large window which is giving this fantastic soft light, and that's all the light I need, and that's lovely. Sometimes when I'm outdoors, I'm then using the sunlight and flashes to fill in shadows, or I'm using reflectors to bounce lights about as well. So I can use external lights outdoors and I can use no lights indoors. But these are the exceptions. Mostly when you say to me, do I prefer indoor or outdoor? They both have advantages and disadvantages. What I like about indoor photography and playing with the lights is the ability to control the light as I want it. Sometimes the natural light isn't going to give me what I want. The sunlight is casting shadows that are too hard, or there isn't sunlight where I want it. The light is falling in the wrong place. So I can control the lighting, and I like that aspect of control. Having said that, I've done several shoots. Well, since lockdown, I've done a lot more outdoor photography, done very little indoor photography. Since the coronavirus started last March last year, most of my photography has been outside, until more recently. Now we're kind of being double vaccinated and doing flow tests and stuff like that. But I rediscovered a freedom with shooting without off-camera flashes, with shooting just in natural daylight or natural daylight with a reflector, and I can set the reflector up there to bounce the light where I want, and all I can do is go click, click, click. What I do tend to find is I take far more photos, because when I'm using artificial lights, I have to wait for that recharge. If I go click, 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 waiting for the flash to go off, the flash will go off for the first one, but it won't have recharged by the time I've clicked the next 3 shots. So the next 3 just all turn out dark. So there's a case of, you line it up, you go click, you've got to have a bit of patience for the flash to recharge itself before you do the second click. Whereas when I'm out, I don't have that restriction. And if I want to do a high-speed burst of 12 shots in a row, I can, without actually having to worry about adjusting lighting settings. So there's a freedom with outdoor photography, which I really quite enjoy. But I also enjoy controlling the light as well. So it all kind of, like the answer to nearly every question, it depends. Okay, April says, wow, I think I'll try that. Stacey says, for those, do you need filters? No, I don't necessarily need filters. Filters just want another piece of equipment you can play with or not. Rosie says, I was at a nearby bird reserve on Saturday looking for a rare visiting hoopoe. Oh, I don't know that one. Hoopoe spelt, but the weather was awful. I will post it on the Facebook page for comments. Okay, cool. Look for that. What other questions have we got here? Oh, my daughter asked me one this morning. She said, how do you get people to feel comfortable in front of the camera? Well, actually, I'm thinking about that. I answered that one a little bit early when I was talking about that notion of the power balance back at the beginning of, people are naturally nervous in front of the camera, so I have to build trust with them. Part of it's I just keep talking to them all the time. I try and be friendly. I identify with our nervousness. It's people skills. But a lot of it is also things like tethering the camera to redress that power balance. But Meg actually then asked a follow-up question to that, which was, how do you get people to feel comfortable behind the camera? And I thought that was kind of interesting, that, because that's more or less what I'm trying to do with you, the viewer, you who are watching now, or you who might be watching the rerun on this. The whole point of the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres podcast is to try and get you more comfortable with your camera, to the point whereby you feel comfortable to explore and try out things and experiment. We do the challenges. To sort of to try things out. We have the critique so that you can get feedback on it. I think we are terrified that everybody else knows what they're doing and we don't, and we're going to look like an idiot. But everybody who takes the photos thinks that. Everybody fears they're going to look like an idiot. And we all got to start somewhere. We get better the more we do it. We continue to make mistakes. We continue to learn. But as I said earlier, we also, we have to remember that everybody who's sticking their photos up online is sticking up their best stuff. We're not looking at the 400 photos they took that didn't work. We're only looking at the one that did. So we have to understand that we are not seeing reality. So when you see other people's photos, don't think that's the reality, that they are therefore brilliant photographers all the time. Understand that that's their best work that they put up, but be inspired by it. Go, hey, don't feel jealous. Just go, if actually that's really good, what do I need to do if I wanted to do something similar? So yeah, I think that's probably about that. What else we got? Oh, Jim says, by clicking your camera so much, is there a maximum click count we should look out for? Maximum click count? I think it comes down to how many photos do you want to go through when you get back home. No, I've had a chat with Robert from Texas with this before, where we talking about the idea of filling a 32 gigabyte card and then going back to the computer and then just having to slog your way through all these photos. No, there is no such thing as a click count. You take as many as you need to either get the photo you need or come to the conclusion you're not going to get the photo you need and abandon it. And that's a personal thing. That's down entirely to your personality, your level of patience, your level of doggedness, where you won't let go, and how much space you've got on your computer as well. So no, I think a click, if any, it almost feels like a really odd thing to say that to me. Is that something that somebody else has said to you, that, oh, if you've taken more than X number of photos, then somehow you're not a real photographer? If it is, that's absolute, insert expletive here. Yeah, no, you take as many as you need to take, either to get the photo you needed or to come to the conclusion you're not going to get the photo you needed. And that's a personal thing in the circumstances you happen to be in. Or you're limited by the size of the card that you've got in your camera. And Jackie says, the more you photograph, the more comfortable you feel. That's true. Very true. Okay, we're going to move on to the third question that I wanted to put out there, which is, what's the best piece of photography advice you've been given? Now, I suppose for me, I would kind of answer that one a little bit earlier with Doriana's question, which is, by and large, for me, the best piece of advice is that understanding that you learn through your mistakes and that you have to embrace the mistakes, not fear them, not beat yourself up for them, but understand that every photo you take is getting you closer to where you want to be. And every photo you take is a learning experience. Now, of course, sometimes there's frustration because that learning experience is taking much longer than you would like. It's taking you 2,000 photos to get to where you wanted rather than 10 photos to get to where you wanted. That comes through experience. But you still have to do it. It's like the idea of if you're at the top of the mountain with the most spectacular view, it's those last 2 or 3 steps you took that take you to the place where you have the spectacular view. But you had 2,000 really crummy naff steps that you had to go through before you got to that point where you had the wonderful view. And those really crummy steps weren't wasted. They weren't unnecessary. They were an absolutely vital point. You had to have each of those steps up the path without the view in order to get to that place where the view is. They are not wasted. They are not pointless. You are not a lesser person because you happen to take those steps. So I think that to me is probably the best piece of advice I think I picked up on, and certainly that I would give on that. So bits of advice that other people have said, and if you've not already sent me something, let me know your best piece of advice that you feel you were given. I love Roy sent me one saying one of his was the best photograph could be the one behind you. I love that. That is so true. Sometimes we are so fixated on getting this that we completely miss what's going on there. I did see a lovely photo once of I think it's somebody sort of photograph, and it's a I don't, it's probably set up, but you've got a picture of somebody sort of there with that great big zoom lens looking out ahead of them at an empty space, and behind them you can see a deer and a fox or something like that, sort of staring at the photographer. You know, it's like everything's going on behind. So yeah, always worth turning around and looking behind. That's a good one. Jackie says, you know your camera inside out, and yeah, that's just a useful practice. The more you do it, the quicker. Really, the practice with the camera means that the camera then stops getting in the way of being able to take the photos. This goes back to Rosemary's point earlier on, which is the kind of restriction is when you're not sure about what you're doing with the camera, you've got to work through all these bits before you can get to the creative bit. And you don't really want the technology getting in the way of you being creative. So you take as many photos as you need to become as familiar as you can with the camera, so that at the point you want to take the photo, you can get to the settings much more quickly. And Brian goes on to say, practice makes perfect, take plenty of images. Doriana says, best piece of advice I was given at turn the camera around to take landscape photos. I think we talked about that. Lots of pictures at different angles to get the right image. And she also goes on to say, what is the story behind the image you're trying to convey? This was all new language to me, but thanks to Kim's tips, these are some of the things I'm working on. Oh, well, it's nice to know that that's working, Doriana. So yeah, and actually, I think Ben also goes on to say as well, his best piece of advice is, what's the story? And certainly it's the one that, oh, Doriana's actually arrived. Hello from Northern Ontario. Hey, Doriana, glad you could make it. I have actually just been reading out some of your, the bits you sent me. So yeah, so both Doriana and Ben have mentioned the idea of what's the story. And it is one of these that I do keep talking about because I still think it is the most important piece of advice. Everything else follows. If you understand the story, I mean, you can understand your camera, you can understand the technical, you can understand aperture and ISO and shutter speed, you can understand full frame and crop frame, you can understand compositional lines and diagonals and rule of thirds and Fibonacci sequences and spirals. You can understand lighting and backlighting and side lighting and multiple lighting and reflections. But if you don't understand story, if you don't understand what it is you're trying to convey, all of this falls flat. The more you can get into the habit of, at the point you're taking the photo, if necessary, say it out loud, or at least say it over in your head, or write it down and say, what is it? Consciously think, what is it I'm trying to capture here? What is it I'm trying to convey here? What mood, what story, what feel, what do I want anybody else who's going to look at that photo, whether it's going out in the public or whether it's just me at a later date looking back at this photo, what do I want this photo to say to me? And what do I want this photo to say to anybody who's looking at it? And if you can answer that question, even half answer that question, then that gives you the much more obvious point of what you do next. Okay, now what aperture settings do I need? What shutter do I need? What angles or diagonals or lighting or anything else? You have to know what your story is first. And once you understand the story, everything else becomes a much easier decision, a clearer decision to make. So yeah, I still think that's probably one of the most important pieces of advice to give. Okay, Jim said, give it room to breathe. Yeah, we talked about that earlier, about just take your photo a little bit bigger than you think it is so that you've got the options. As he says, he always tends to frame his images a bit too tight, and also to remember the rule of thirds. I think the rule of thirds is a useful one. Sometimes you don't need it, and in fact, the next thing we're going to be talking about next week is actually a time when you don't use the rule of thirds. But yes, it's a useful one to just understand that quite often, probably 7 or 8 times out of 10, just having your subject off center tends to make the whole thing flow a bit better. Rosemary says, learn to see in photographs even when you don't have your camera. Better yet, keep your camera with you. See the light, the composition, the textures, the stories, the mood, learn to see. I wish I could remember where I learned this. I have a long way to go before it will become second nature, but the more deliberately I practice seeing in photographs, the more it improves my ability to observe the world and to pre-visualize shots before I lift the camera. I think that's a really good point, Rosemary. I think there's a thing, even if you don't have your camera with you, it could be quite interesting to just, certainly if you're out and about in an interesting thing, think, if I have my camera, what would I, where are the bits, what are the interesting bits here? Where are the, it's really find the story. Find this, where are the stories in this? How would they look? And if you can learn to sort of kind of get a sense of how they look, then again, it's all practice. It just means that at the point you do come to take the photos, it flows, it gets there that little bit more quickly. Okay, any more questions? Here's your chance here. I think we've pretty much come to the end of the questions. The questions I've given you. Is there any more advice that you think everybody should know, or that was a really good piece of advice that you were given? Or is there any last questions you want to ask me before we start wrapping up this this podcast? That's still up to 77 degrees. We might just get to the end, and then I'm going to have to turn this off. Oh, Rosie says, not necessarily the best piece of advice I received, but one that stuck was the best camera is the one you have in your hand. Oh, yes. I know I've heard this one before, and it really is true. I think it's good. It's very easy to get into a habit of thinking of, it's like I kind of said, when I was there, I was in the desert, in the place, and at the point I'm there, I suddenly realized essentially I've got the wrong lens, or is it the wrong? The wrong lens is actually the wrong way of putting it. What I had a different lens, the one that I was expecting to have, that I felt that would have given me my pre-visualized shot. But because I then had it and I realized it, I changed the way I did. I adapted to the circumstances. That a camera in your hand, even without the lens that you would ideally have liked to have, is still better than no camera in your hand, and is an ideal learning opportunity. So the best camera is the one that's in your hand, rather than having to run off home and not do it taking the photo because you just kind of felt fed up that you didn't have the right equipment with you. So that's a good one. Jim says, take one step to the left or to the right. That's always, change your angle. We can get very easily fixated on just taking the photo from here. Move around, go up a bit, go low, go left, go right. All these things are really useful to do when you're taking photos. April says, make sure your batteries are charged. Oh, absolutely. Yes. And in fact, actually, we turned up this morning from Amazon. There's another 4 packs of batteries. But no, they're not counting that for my flashes, because but yeah, you don't want to be caught short of that. Always take spare ones. Rosie says, Jim, make sure you don't go over the edge. Yes, taking a step to the left or right might depend on where you're standing. Doriana says, what's the best way to take black and white photos? Should I take them in color first, then convert them to black and white? And what's the best editing tool? Absolutely, take them in color. If you haven't watched them already, I have past episodes where, in fact, even we're here on YouTube, go to youtube.com/Kim Ayres. There you will find all the past episodes about understanding photography with Kim Ayres. What you will also find is some of these I have bite-size versions. Go to the bite-size playlist where I've taken particular sections, and I know in the bite-size I've got things like 4 ways to convert to black and white. Now, if you convert to black and white in camera, just on your camera settings, flick to black and white, it removes all the color options and you are limited to what the camera dictates. If you take the photos in color, Then when you put them into editing software, pretty much any editing software, you have more control over converting to black and white. Now I use Photoshop, that gives me lots of options, but there's quite a lot of, I know Jim uses Affinity and Roy uses Affinity, I think, and they both have lots of black and white options as well. So take it in color, convert afterwards, where you'll have more different ways of doing it. So yeah, absolutely with that. Okay, so that pretty much brings us to the end of this, and that's still sitting at 77 degrees. I think the max is 79 at that point. I don't know whether the computer melts or just switches off. Next week, hopefully, desperately hopefully, I will have the new computer. I will have put all the stuff on it and I will have it working, so that next Tuesday I am going to be finally talking about asymmetrical symmetry. This is what I should have been talking about last week, or was going to be talking about this week, and I will be setting a challenge for the following week precisely about it. And in brief, the notion of asymmetrical symmetry is the idea of asymmetry is not balanced. Symmetry is balanced, is a balance. So a circle is completely symmetrical. A square is completely symmetrical, or symmetrical left and right. A rectangle is symmetrical, yeah, that's symmetrical as well, but a triangle, not quite so. You can cut it in half one way, but if you cut it another way, it won't be. So, and rule of thirds is you are creating an asymmetrical picture. So it's not balanced on both sides, whereas a symmetrical picture is perfectly balanced on each side. Asymmetrical symmetry is where you're looking like it's balanced, but it's not quite. And that's where it becomes really, really interesting, the not quite symmetrical. And it's a really useful one to properly understand, because then it becomes a great tool in your toolbox for when rule of thirds isn't going to do it for you. So that's what I'm going to be talking about in depth next week. And hopefully, if I don't have the camera, we'll do the new computer, we'll work something else out. But that I will be talking about that. I will be giving examples and hopefully teaching you a bit more with that. Then the other thing is hopefully we'll be returning to the critique section. So there's a couple of people who sent in images for critique. Hopefully they would turn up in last week. I probably have space for another one or two, if you have an image that you would like to get into critique as well. If you found this useful, interesting, and you would like to support these podcasts, invite your friends along. Let's grow this. Actually, there was one more question, which I think was Rosemary said. No, it wasn't Rosemary. How do we have? I can't remember now. There was something like I suddenly lost it. There was a comment somewhere about is there anything I would like to have achieved that I haven't photographically? And pretty much my answer to that is yes. These podcasts. I want to grow these podcasts. I want to have lots of people watching them. I want global fame. I want to be a YouTuber. I want to be an influencer. No, I just want more people to have fun with these podcasts. So if you know anybody else, invite them along. Spread the word. Let's build these podcasts a bit more. And in the meantime, if you want to support them, you can also go to buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres. So a couple more. Okay, a few people saying, thanks for a great night. Glad it went well. Yep, and Roy says we managed to get through without meltdown, almost. Okay, cool. I'm really glad everybody's enjoyed it. Thank you so much to everybody who turned up. I was convinced I would maybe only have about 3 people here, and that would include me, my wife, and my daughter. Thank you to everybody who submitted questions, everybody who turned up, everybody who was in the chat, and I hope you found it useful. So look forward to seeing you all next week on Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. Thank you so much. And I don't have an end card to come up, so I'll just have to click end stream and it will all be rather abrupt. Cheerio. Bye-bye.